The train groaned, a weary iron beast surrendering to the end of the line. For 3 days, its rhythmic clatter had been the only constant in Eliza's world, a world that had shrunk to the grime on the window and the relentless, shifting panorama of the American continent. Now, the groaning stopped. A final, shuddering sigh of steam hissed into the air, tasting of metal and coal dust. This was it. Redemption. Arizona Territory. The name felt like a cruel joke whispered by a god she no longer trusted. Eliza moved with the stiffness of a woman twice her 24 years. Her bones ached with a deep, settled exhaustion that sleep could not touch. She smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress, a garment of grim practicality that had seemed sturdy and respectable back in Ohio, but felt flimsy and foolish under the unfiltered glare of the western sun. It was a sun that did not warm, it baked, bleaching the very color from the sky, which stretched over the town like a vast, pale shroud. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street flanked by skeletal wooden buildings. Their false fronts stood like tombstones, their paint peeled away by a wind that never seemed to stop its mournful song. Dust was everywhere. It coated the boardwalks, settled in a fine red film on her eyelashes, and worked its way into the seams of her worn leather shoes. It was the color of dried blood and forgotten things. She clutched her small valise, its handles slick with the sweat of her palm, and stood on the station platform. Other passengers, rough-looking men with sun-cracked faces, a few weary families whose children stared with wide, silent eyes, disembarked and were swallowed by the town's heat-shimmering emptiness. Eliza remained. She scanned the faces, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She was looking for a Mr. Silas Croft, his letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases were worn transparent, was tucked into her bodice. It had promised a new life, a respectable marriage to a man of good standing, a widower with a small farm who needed a wife to make his house a home. His words were plain, God-fearing, and offered the one thing she craved above all else, an escape. An hour passed. The station agent, a man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, began sweeping the platform, each scrape of his broom against the wood an accusation against her stillness. The sun climbed higher, pressing down with a physical weight. Eliza's hope, a fragile seedling she had nurtured across 1,000 miles of rail, began to wither. Another hour bled into the next. The town's rhythm became apparent. Doors opened and closed. A wagon rattled past, its wheels churning up a fresh cloud of the ever-present dust. Women, their faces shielded by dark bonnets, emerged from the general store, casting brief, assessing glances her way before leaning their heads together. Their whispers were too distant to be heard, but their meaning was as clear as the sharp shadows they cast upon the ground. A woman alone, waiting, unclaimed. She saw them look at her simple dress, her uncovered hair, her solitary figure, and she knew the word they were thinking. It was a word that had been used to cage her for years, immodest. The man was not coming. The realization did not arrive in a sudden crash, but seeped into her bones like the desert cold that would surely follow the day's oppressive heat. Mr. Silas Croft was not a man of good standing. He was not a widower with a farm. He was ink on paper, a hollow promise that had lured her into this desolate purgatory and abandoned her at its gates. The last of her husband's money, saved one secret coin at a time, had been spent on the train ticket. She had exactly $1.14 left in her reticule. It was not enough for a ticket back, even if there was a back to go to. There was not. She had burned that bridge, and the smoke was still choking her. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the distant, jagged mountains in hues of bruised purple, a woman detached herself from the shadows of the church porch. She was tall and thin, her body as rigid as the wooden cross that topped the steeple behind her. She moved toward Eliza with a purposeful stride, her black dress absorbing the light around her. "You are the one who arrived on the noon train," she said, It was not a question. Her voice was flat, without welcome. "Yes, ma'am," Eliza answered, her own voice sounding small and foreign. "I am waiting for Mr. Silas Croft." The woman's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "There is no Mr. Croft in Redemption." Eliza's throat closed. "But his letter, he wrote from here. He has a farm. Many men write letters. Miss, not all of them are written in truth." The woman's eyes, the color of faded slate, roamed over Eliza from head to toe. "You traveled a long way. Alone." "I had no choice." "There is always a choice to remain within the bounds of propriety," the woman stated, her tone sharpening with the cold edge of judgment. "I am Mrs. Gable. My husband is the Reverend here. I feel it is my Christian duty to warn you. A town like this, a woman who arrives under such circumstances, you will be judged harshly. Your soul is a fragile thing, easily stained by rumor." Eliza felt a familiar coldness spread through her chest. This was a language she knew well, the language of sin and stain, of female weakness and public shame. It was the language her husband, the Reverend back in Ohio, had used as both a whip and a leash. For a moment, she was not in Arizona. She was back in the stifling parlor, the heavy drapes drawn against the sun, his voice droning on about her flawed, tempting nature, his hand heavy on her shoulder. She straightened her spine, a small, involuntary act of defiance. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Gable. I am merely looking for a place to stay the night, and then work." Mrs. Gable's expression did not soften. "The inn is not a respectable place for a woman in your position. And work will be hard to find for someone without a name to recommend them." She paused, a flicker of something that might have been pity but looked more like satisfaction in her eyes. "The Reverend may be able to offer you shelter, of a sort. Come." She turned and walked back toward the church, not waiting to see if Eliza followed. With nowhere else to go, Eliza picked up her valise and trailed in her wake, feeling like a stray dog being led to a kennel. The shelter Mrs. Gable had spoken of was not in the parsonage, a neat white house beside the church. It was behind it, the stable. The air inside was thick with the sweet, pungent smell of hay and the sharper ammonia tang of horse manure. A single horse shifted in its stall, its soft snort loud in the evening quiet. "You may sleep here," Mrs. Gable said, gesturing to a pile of clean hay in an empty stall. "It is warmer than the street. The Lord provides for all his creatures." She looked at Eliza's face, perhaps expecting gratitude. All she saw was a numb, quiet pallor. With a final, pursed-lipped nod, she left, pulling the heavy wooden door almost closed, plunging the stable into a deep, velvety darkness. Humiliation was a hot, bitter taste in the back of Eliza's throat. She did not cry. The tears had dried up long ago, leaving behind a barren landscape inside her. She sank onto the hay, the rough stalks pricking through the fabric of her dress, her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. She had not eaten since a stale piece of bread that morning on the train. She was alone, penniless, and sleeping in a barn in a town that had already condemned her. She had fled a cage only to find herself in a vast, open prison, lying back in the darkness, surrounded by the soft sounds of the horse chewing. She pulled her thin shawl around her shoulders and listened to the wind howling outside, a lonely sound that echoed her own heart. The next morning, she washed her face with cold, metallic-tasting water from the horse trough. Using a corner of her petticoat as a cloth, she pinned her hair back up, her fingers clumsy and stiff. She had to find work. It was the only thought she could allow herself to hold on to. Any work. She started at the inn. A large, bustling woman with a sweat-sheened face and flour on her apron met her at the door. "Help?" the woman barked in response to Eliza's quiet inquiry. "Lord, no. Got my girls. No room for more." Her eyes swept over Eliza, lingering for a moment on the faint bits of straw clinging to her skirt. The dismissal was swift and absolute. Next, the general store. The air inside was a mix of smells: coffee beans, cured leather, salted pork, and something sweet and spicy, like cinnamon. A man with spectacles perched on his nose was weighing out sugar for a customer. Eliza waited patiently, her hands clasped in front of her. When it was her turn, she stepped forward. "Good morning, sir. I was wondering if you might be in need of any help. I can keep books, I can clean. I am a hard worker." The man, Mr. Henderson, looked up from his ledger. He pushed his spectacles up his nose and peered at her. His gaze was not unkind, but it was wary. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I hear you came in on the train yesterday." "Yes, sir." "And that you were expecting to be met." The heat rose in Eliza's cheeks. The arrangement was not as I was led to believe. "I'm sure," he said, his eyes darting toward the front window, as if worried they would be seen. "The thing is, this is a small town. Talk gets around. It wouldn't be, well, it would be bad for business, for you to be working here. You understand." She understood perfectly. She was a stain, a piece of gossip. To associate with her was to risk catching the taint of her impropriety. "Thank you for your time," she murmured, and turned to leave before he could see the tremor in her hands. She was halfway to the door when it opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, and the doorway seemed to shrink around him. He wore dusty, worn jeans and a plain chambray shirt that was stretched taut across a broad set of shoulders. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-baked rock. Every line on it told a story of wind and sun and hard living. He was not young, but not old either, somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, barely flickered in her direction as he moved past her toward the counter. He carried himself with a heavy, deliberate stillness, as if he were conserving energy for something that mattered. Eliza pushed the door open and stepped back out into the blinding sun, the storekeeper's rejection ringing in her ears. She stood on the boardwalk, her small valise at her feet, and did not know which way to turn. Every door was closed to her. Every face was turned away. The street seemed to stretch for an eternity in either direction, offering no path forward. The panic she had held at bay was beginning to rise, cold and suffocating. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was the man from the store. He was standing a few feet away, holding a sack of flour over one shoulder. He did not look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Heard you were looking for work," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. Eliza flinched, expecting another refusal, another piece of thinly veiled advice. "I am—" He was silent for a long moment. She could feel the reluctance coming off him in waves. This was not a man who invited complication into his life. "Got work on my ranch," he said finally, his eyes still on the horizon. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the chickens. Hard work." She stared at him, suspicion and desperation warring within her. A man, a stranger, offering her work on a remote ranch. She knew what the women who whispered behind their hands would call that. She knew the danger of it. Her entire life had been a lesson in the danger of being alone with a man. As if he could read her thoughts. He finally turned his head and met her eyes. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of stoicism. "It's just work, a cot in the bunkhouse, $1 a week and your keep." Nothing more. The directness of his words cut through her fear. There was no charm in them, no false promise, just a blunt, unadorned offer. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she had stepped off that train. He was offering her survival, not salvation, and survival was all she dared to hope for. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I accept." He gave a short, curt nod. "Name's Luke. My wagon's over there. Be ready to leave in 10 minutes." He turned and walked away without another word, his stride long and sure. The ride to his homestead was made in near total silence. The only sounds were the creak and groan of the wagon wheels, the clink of the horses' harnesses, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. Luke handled the reins with an economy of motion, his hands firm and capable. He did not speak, and Eliza did not dare to. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the landscape unfold. It was a brutal, beautiful country. The dry land stretched endlessly in every direction, a tapestry of muted browns and grays and dusty greens. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels against the pale sky. Gnarled mesquite and palo verde trees clung to the arid soil, their branches twisted into tormented shapes. They passed deep, shadow-filled canyons that sliced through the earth like jagged wounds. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. It made her feel infinitesimally small, a tiny, fragile speck in a vast and indifferent wilderness. It should have been terrifying, but it was not. Back home, the world had been small and suffocating, a collection of rooms and rules that pressed in on her. Here, there was nothing but space. They arrived as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, setting the sky on fire. The ranch was nestled in a small valley, protected on one side by a high, rocky mesa. It was not a place of comfort. The house was a simple structure of adobe and rough-hewn timber, more a shelter than a home. A large barn, a corral, and a few smaller outbuildings stood nearby, all of them looking as weathered and unyielding as the man who owned them. Luke pulled the wagon to a halt near a long, low building. "That's the bunkhouse," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Your cot's in the far corner. Put a blanket up for you. Cook stove's in there, too. Supper's at 7. For me and 2 hands. Don't be late." He swung himself down from the wagon and began to unhitch the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. He had given his instructions, and as far as he was concerned, the conversation was over. Eliza climbed down, her legs unsteady. The bunkhouse smelled of unwashed bodies, leather, and stale tobacco smoke. It was a fiercely masculine space. In the corner, as he had said, was a simple rope cot with a thin mattress. A coarse wool blanket had been nailed to a roof beam, creating a flimsy screen that offered the barest illusion of privacy. This was her new home. That night, after serving a silent meal of beans and salted pork to Luke and his 2 taciturn ranch hands, Eliza lay on her cot and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert. The yip of a distant coyote, the chirping of crickets, the low whisper of the wind as it moved through the sagebrush. She got up and walked to the open doorway of the bunkhouse, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders against the surprising chill of the night air. The sky was a spectacle. Without the lights of a city, the stars were scattered across the blackness like a spill of diamonds, so bright and close it felt as though she could reach up and touch them. The moon cast a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape, silvering the edges of the desert hills and deepening the shadows in the canyons. She looked out at the harsh, majestic beauty of it all. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. It offered no comfort and made no promises. For the first time since she could remember, there was no one watching her, no one to tell her what to think or how to feel or what to pray for. There was only the vast, silent land and the endless, star-dusted sky. A great wave of fear washed over her, fear of the emptiness, of the silence, of the hard-faced man sleeping somewhere out in the darkness. But tangled up with the fear was another feeling, something new and startling and fierce. It was freedom. And as she stood there, shivering in the cold desert air, Eliza realized it was the first time in her life she had ever truly felt it. The days settled into a rhythm as stark and unvarying as the landscape itself. Eliza's life was measured not by the clock, but by the sun. She rose before it did, when the air was still sharp with a chill that belied the coming furnace of the day. She coaxed the fire in the cook stove to life, put the coffee on to boil, and mixed the dough for the day's biscuits. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint, grew calloused and strong. She learned the heft of a cast-iron skillet, the precise way to pluck a chicken, the ache in the small of her back that came from scrubbing the bunkhouse floor on her hands and knees. The meals were silent affairs. The two ranch hands, a wiry old-timer named Abe and a younger man called Charlie, whose face was a permanent mask of dust, ate with a focused, animal efficiency. They did not speak to her beyond a mumbled "mornin'" or a grunt of thanks. They were not unkind. She simply did not exist for them beyond her function as the person who filled their plates and their coffee cups. And then there was Luke. He was a creature of profound silence, a man who seemed to take up space in the world without disturbing the air around him. He did not sleep in the bunkhouse with his men. Eliza learned his habits by observation. Most nights, he took a bedroll into the barn, preferring the company of his horses. On nights when the sky was clear and bright with stars, he would simply walk out into the desert and sleep on the hard, ungiving earth. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, and his words were tools he used only when absolutely necessary. A quiet command to his horse, a brief instruction to his men, a curt nod to Eliza to signal that the meal was done. He was a ghost at his own table. His presence defined more by what he withheld than by what he offered. Weeks bled into one another. The initial terror Eliza had felt began to recede, replaced by a deep, weary acceptance. This was her life now. Hard labor, silent meals, and the fiery spectacle of a dusty sunrise that promised only another day just like the one before. Yet, in the heart of this emptiness, a strange thing happened. The tight knot of fear in her stomach, a knot tied by her husband's hands years ago, began to loosen. Here, no one preached at her. No one quoted scripture to condemn the curve of her hip or the stray wisp of hair that escaped her bun. Here, her body was not a vessel of sin. It was a tool for work. Its aches were honest. Its exhaustion was earned. One afternoon, during the branding, the air was thick with the stench of singed hair and the terrified bawling of calves. The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky. Luke worked shirtless alongside Abe and Charlie, his body lean and corded with muscle, slick with sweat and grime. When they finally broke for water, he came to the barrel near the house, picked up the bucket, and poured its contents over his head. The water streamed down his face, his chest, and his back, and that is when she saw them. Eliza was on the porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl, and the sight made her hands freeze in their task. His back, from his shoulders down to his waist, was a map of old pain. The scars were white and puckered against his sun-darkened skin, some long and thin like whip marks, others wider, uglier, as if laid open by something heavier. They were old wounds, long since healed, but they spoke of a history that made the harshness of his present life seem like a gentle reprieve. He carried his pain on the outside. A deep, resonant pang of recognition echoed within her. He did not see her watching. He slicked his wet hair back, grabbed a clean shirt from a nail on the porch post, and pulled it on, hiding the story of his skin once more. Eliza's own scars were invisible. They were not etched on her skin, but on her soul. Her husband, the Reverend Michael, had been a man whose piety was a cloak for his cruelty. His abuse had not been a matter of simple blows, though there had been a few of those, delivered with a prayer and an expression of sorrow for her sinful nature that had provoked him. His true violence had been quieter, more insidious. He had used God as his weapon. He had dissected her thoughts, her desires, her very being, and found sin in every part. He had told her that a wife's body was a vessel for her husband's needs, a test of her obedience to God's law. Their marital bed had not been a place of intimacy, but a place of coercion, a silent, spiritual violation where her lack of enthusiasm was proof of her impure heart. He had broken her in the quiet rooms of the parsonage, convincing her that her own spirit was a wicked thing that needed to be tamed. The scars he had left were a profound sense of worthlessness, a flinching revulsion to a man's touch, and a certainty that her body was a thing to be hidden and ashamed of. Luke's pain. She now understood. Was the reason for his silence. It was a wall he had built around himself, and she was living in its shadow. One night, a coyote's cry woke her from a shallow sleep. The bunkhouse was filled with the soft snores of Abe and Charlie. A powerful thirst clawed at her throat. She slipped from her cot, her bare feet silent on the cool dirt floor, and went outside to the water pump. The moon was a slender crescent, offering little light. As she passed the wide-open door of the barn, she heard a sound, a low, guttural cry, choked off as if the dreamer were fighting against it. She stopped, her hand on the cold handle of the pump. She knew she should walk away, that this was a private thing, but she was rooted to the spot. Anna. The name was a ragged whisper, torn from a place of deep agony. There was a long silence, filled only with the soft rustle of horses in their stalls. Then, another sound, a word filled with such venomous betrayal it made Eliza's blood run cold. Liar! She heard the rustle of his bedroll, a sharp intake of breath as he forced himself awake from the dream's grip. Eliza turned and fled back to the bunkhouse, her heart hammering. She lay on her cot, the thirst forgotten, and stared into the darkness behind her blanket screen. His fortress of silence had a crack in it. A woman named Anna had put it there, a woman he believed to be a liar. The next day, the air between them felt different, though nothing had changed. The silence at the breakfast table was the same. His nod of dismissal was the same. But now, when she looked at him, she saw the ghost of a nightmare in his pale blue eyes. She was frying salted pork for the midday meal, lost in thought. When it happened, her mind was on the name Anna, on the scars on his back. The skillet handle was slick with grease. Her grip slipped, her hand, trying to steady the heavy pan, brushed against its searing hot edge. Pain, white-hot and immediate, shot up her arm. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp, and dropped the fork she was holding. It clattered loudly on the floor. She cradled her hand to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut against the wave of nausea that followed the pain. A large, angry red welt was already rising on the back of her hand. Luke was just outside, mending a rein. He must have heard her cry. Before she could compose herself, he was standing in the bunkhouse doorway, his large frame blocking the light. "What is it?" he asked, his voice flat, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "It is nothing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was careless." He ignored her words and crossed the room in 2 long strides. "Let me see." It was not a request. He gently took her wrist and turned her hand over, his thumb brushing against her palm. His touch was firm, yet surprisingly soft. His own hands were a testament to his life, calloused, scarred, and strong, but they held hers with an unexpected reverence. The heat of the burn was nothing compared to the shock of his skin against hers. It was the first time a man had touched her in kindness in more than a year. His face remained impassive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. Fool thing to do. He let go of her wrist and went to the water barrel in the corner, ladling cool water into a tin basin. He took a strip of clean cloth from a hook on the wall, one she used for wrapping bread. He dipped it into the water, wrung it out, and came back to her. He took her hand again. She did not pull away. He carefully, gently, wrapped the cool, wet cloth around the burn. His fingers brushed against hers, slow and deliberate. She could feel the slight tremor in them. Or was it her own hand that was shaking? Their eyes met over her bandaged hand. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was a living thing, charged with a tension that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his pale blue eyes, smell the faint scent of leather and dust that clung to him. Then, as if remembering himself, he dropped her hand and stepped back. "Be more careful," he said, his voice a low rasp. He turned and walked out of the bunkhouse without looking back, leaving her with a throbbing hand and a wildly beating heart. 2 days later, the sky turned against them. The morning had been ordinary, the sun hot in a cloudless sky. But by late afternoon, the horizon to the west had turned a bruised, angry purple. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric hum. The birds fell silent. Then the wind came, a sudden, violent gust that whipped dust and loose hay into swirling vortexes. Luke looked up at the sky, his face grim. "Storm's coming," he yelled to Abe and Charlie, who were mending a fence line. "Get the horses in, now!" The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, hitting the dry earth with audible splats. Then the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world into a gray chaos. Eliza stood on the porch, watching as the 3 men struggled to herd the spooked horses toward the safety of the barn. The rain was coming down so hard the corral was already turning into a sea of mud. One of the younger horses panicked, rearing and fighting against Charlie's rope. Without thinking, Eliza ran off the porch and into the storm. The cold shock of the rain stole her breath. Her dress was soaked through in an instant, plastering itself to her skin. Her hair came undone, hanging in heavy, dripping ropes down her back. She grabbed a trailing lead rope and moved to head off the terrified horse, turning it back toward the barn. She worked alongside Luke, a silent team in the heart of the storm's fury. They were shoulder to shoulder in the mud and the driving rain, their movements synchronized by the shared, urgent task. The world was reduced to the slick mud under her feet, the panicked whites of the horse's eyes, and the solid, reassuring presence of the man beside her. When the last horse was finally safe in the barn, they stood for a moment in the doorway, dripping and breathing hard, the roar of the rain on the tin roof deafening. He looked at her, his face streaked with rain and mud. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes before he turned away to help the others. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the wet landscape in a soft, golden light. It was dark by the time Eliza finished her chores. She was still damp, and a chill had settled deep into her bones. She saw Luke's shirt, the one he had worn in the storm, slung over a corral fence rail. A casualty of the day's chaos. It was covered in mud. An impulse, born of the moment their hands had touched, moved her. She picked it up. It was heavy with water. She carried it to the pump at the edge of the yard. In the deepening twilight, she began to wash it. The fabric was coarse under her knuckles. It smelled of him, of sweat and leather and horse and the clean scent of rain on sun-baked earth. It felt like an act of profound intimacy, to be washing away the dirt and labor of his day. The night was quiet. The other men were in the bunkhouse. Luke, she assumed, was in the barn. She thought herself completely alone, wrapped in the privacy of the darkness. Her own blouse, still damp, clung to her uncomfortably, the wet fabric chilling her skin, acting on another impulse, one of simple creature comfort. She looked around, saw no one, and quickly unbuttoned the front of her blouse. She slipped it from her shoulders, leaving her standing in the cool night air in only her thin chemise. The relief was immediate, a soft caress of air on her damp skin. She hung her blouse next to his shirt and went back to scrubbing. She did not hear him approach. The first she knew of his presence was a subtle shift in the shadows, a sudden feeling of being watched. She gasped and spun around, clutching his wet shirt to her chest like a shield. Luke stood not 10 feet away, a dark, silent silhouette against the last of the evening light. He had come from the barn, his steps as quiet as a predator's. She froze, her mind a riot of shame and terror. She was half undressed, alone with him in the dark. This was how ruin started. She expected a look of disgust, a harsh word of reprimand, a command to cover herself. But his face, what she could see of it in the gloom, held none of that. His eyes were fixed on her, and his expression was one of raw, unguarded intensity. He was not looking at her with judgment, but with a kind of searing recognition, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her. For the very first time, he saw the goosebumps on her arms, the vulnerable line of her neck, the fear in her eyes. And he saw something more. He saw the shame she had carried for so long. He took a slow step forward. She flinched but held her ground. He stopped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly whisper that was somehow rougher and more tender than she had ever heard it. "Leave it off," he said. Her breath caught in her throat. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the shirt. His eyes held hers, a silent, powerful current passing between them in the dark. "I'll teach you heat." His words hung in the cool night air, a promise and a challenge. "I'll teach you heat." Eliza stood frozen, the damp shirt a flimsy shield clutched against her chemise. The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the intense, unblinking focus of his pale eyes. Every instinct she had learned at the hands of the Reverend Michael screamed at her to run, to cover herself, to apologize for the sin of her own skin. Her husband had taught her that heat was the devil's tool, the path to damnation that began with a woman's unguarded flesh. But Luke was not her husband, and his eyes held no condemnation. They held a reflection of her own profound loneliness, a deep, aching sorrow she recognized as her own. In that moment, she made a choice. It was not a choice born of passion or reckless desire, but of a desperate, bone-deep need to feel something other than cold and fear. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He did not move toward her. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, his silence an invitation. After a moment's hesitation, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs, she left his shirt and her blouse hanging on the line and followed him. Inside, the long room was quiet save for the soft snores of Abe and Charlie, who were dead to the world in their cots at the far end. The embers in the cook stove cast a low, flickering orange glow, painting the rough-hewn walls in shifting shadows. It was a small circle of warmth in the vast darkness. Luke was standing by the stove, his back to her. He had added a small piece of wood, and the embers pulsed with new life. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. She stopped a few feet from him, her arms crossed over her chest, a gesture of self-protection she could not stop. He did not seem to notice, or if he did not comment. He simply watched her, giving her the space to breathe, to run, to stay. Slowly, as if approaching a skittish colt, he raised a hand. He did not reach for her waist or her arms, but for her shoulder. His calloused fingers brushed against the bare skin above her chemise, his touch so light it was barely a whisper. It was a touch of profound respect, a question asked without words. And for the first time in her life, under the touch of a man, Eliza did not flinch. The tension in her own shoulders, a posture of defense she had held for years, seemed to melt away under the gentle pressure of his hand. She looked up at him, her eyes adjusting to the firelight, and saw the deep lines of weariness and pain etched around his own. They were two broken things, standing in the shadows. She gave another small nod, this one more certain. That was all he needed. His other hand came up to her other shoulder, and he simply held her there for a long moment, letting her grow accustomed to his presence, his touch. Then, with an infinite, painstaking slowness, he lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was chaste, and yet more intimate than any of the brutish, dutiful encounters she had endured in her marriage. It was a kiss that offered comfort, not demand. His hands moved from her shoulders, one tracing the line of her spine, the other cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her still damp hair. He guided her, never pushed. Every movement was a suggestion, a quiet offering that she had the power to refuse. And in that power, in that absolute absence of coercion, her fear began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, flickering curiosity. The connection that followed was unlike anything she had ever known. It was raw, born of 2 lifetimes of solitude and hurt. It was intense, a silent conversation between 2 people who did not know how to speak of their pain. But threaded through it all was a deep, abiding tenderness. He was unhurried, his focus entirely on her, on the subtle language of her body. He learned the places that made her tremble, not with fear, but with a new and startling sensation. He did not rush to his own satisfaction. He did not beg or demand or take. It was a mutual exploration, a slow and sacred healing. He taught her that heat was not a sin to be punished, but a warmth to be shared, a fire that could cauterize old wounds, and for the first time, Eliza learned that her body was not a source of shame, but a vessel capable of a quiet, breathtaking pleasure. Afterward, as the fire in the stove burned down to a soft, pulsing glow, she lay curled on his narrow cot, her head resting on his chest. The thin blanket was pulled over them both. She listened to the slow, steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that was solid and real in the quiet darkness. A profound tremor went through her, a delayed shock at what had just happened. She was not disgusted. She was not ashamed. She felt safe. The feeling was so foreign, so utterly new. It was almost frightening. She was shaken by the simple goodness of it. He lay still, his arm around her, his hand resting lightly on her hair. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space. "My name was not always good for much," he said finally, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. "But once, it was all I had." Eliza remained still, listening. "There was a woman," he continued, his voice tight with the memory. "Anna. Her father owned the biggest ranch in the county where I grew up. She was beautiful, like a wildflower you find blooming in a crack in a rock. I thought she was the purest thing I had ever seen." He shifted slightly. "She liked the attention of a rough hand like me, made her feel adventurous. We met in secret, one night. She was the one who led me to the hayloft. She was the one who unbuttoned her own dress. I was a fool. I thought she felt what I felt." He took a deep breath, the sound of it painful. "Her father found us. She started screaming, said I had forced her, said I had torn her dress. She lied. Her father and her brothers. They did not ask for my side of the story. They took turns with a horsewhip. That is how I got these." He shifted again, and she knew he was referring to the scars on his back. "They ran me out of the county, ruined my name. I learned then that a woman's word, true or not, can be a weapon, and that trust is a fool's game." Eliza pictured it, the vicious lies, the brutal beating, the public humiliation. It explained everything: his solitude, his silence, his reluctance to even look at her when she first arrived. She lifted her head and looked at him, her heart aching for the young man he must have been. Her own story felt like a stone in her throat. She had never spoken of it to anyone. To speak of it was to give it a reality she tried to deny. But in the warm, safe darkness of his cot, the words began to come, hesitant and broken. "I was married," she began, her voice a near whisper, "to a preacher. He was a man of God. Everyone said so. He told me that my body was a temptation, a snare for my own soul and for the souls of men. He said it was a wife's duty to submit, but that pleasure was vanity. It was a sin. He said that a woman's desire was a wicked thing." She could feel Luke's body tense beneath her, his arm tightening around her. "He would quote the scripture to me while he was with me. He said it was for procreation, a holy duty, but it felt cold, like a punishment. He made me feel dirty for being a woman. He told me my soul was stained, and that he was my only hope for salvation. To be touched by him was to be reminded of my own evil. She finished, the last words barely audible, the shame of them still a fresh and burning wound. Luke did not speak for a long time. She could feel the anger radiating from him, a silent, protective fury. His fists, she knew, were clenched at his sides. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply held her, his quiet rage a testament to her truth. He believed her, and in that simple belief, a piece of the great, crushing weight she had carried for so long began to lift. The morning after, and all the mornings that followed, were different. The silence between them remained, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer a vast, empty canyon separating them, but a quiet, comfortable valley where they could exist together without the need for words. He started waiting for her to bring her plate to the table before he began to eat. She started mending the small tears in his shirts without being asked. One day, he was digging new post holes for a stretch of fence that had come down in the storm. The work was hard, the ground baked solid by the sun. Eliza brought him a dipper of cool water. She stood and watched as he worked, the muscles in his back and arms moving with a powerful, rhythmic grace. A post slipped, too heavy for him to manage alone. Without a word, she moved to the other side, grabbed hold of the rough timber, and helped him guide it into the hole. They worked together, their hands brushing, their breath mingling in the dry air. They did not speak. They did not need to. They were building something, more than just a fence. He began to ask her to ride with him into town for supplies. The first time, she sat on the wagon bench beside him, the distance between them feeling charged and significant. Redemption had not changed. The dust was still the color of dried blood, and the wind still sang its mournful song. But now, she was not alone. The whispers started immediately. She saw them in the way the women clustered together outside the general store, their hands flying to their mouths as the wagon passed. She heard it in the sudden silence that fell when she and Luke walked into the store. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, saw her and turned away with a look of such profound disgust that Eliza felt the color drain from her face. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, who had once looked at her with a kind of weary pity, now refused to meet her eyes. Luke gave him their list. Mr. Henderson filled the order, his movements stiff and jerky. When he handed the heavy sacks to Luke, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Luke, you are a good man, but people are talking. It is not right. A woman like that, living out at your place, unmarried. It is not decent." Before Eliza could even register the sting of his words, Luke's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous as a rattler's warning. "She is with me. Her decency is not your concern." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Mr. Henderson paled and said no more, but the damage was done. As they were leaving, another man entered the store. He was a neighboring rancher, a portly, self-important man named Jedediah Caldwell. He was known for his piety and his prize-winning bulls. He nodded curtly to Luke. "Caldwell," Luke acknowledged. "Heard you were looking to buy that Hereford bull of mine," Caldwell said, his eyes flicking from Luke to Eliza and back again, a smirk playing on his lips. "Decided against it. I prefer to do business with men who keep respectable company." The public insult was a physical blow. Eliza could feel the eyes of everyone in the store on them. Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply took her elbow, his grip firm and steadying, and guided her out of the store and back to the wagon. The cattle deal was important. She knew it from the way he had talked about improving his herd. And now, because of her, it was lost. The stain she had feared she carried was spreading, tainting him, costing him. That night, she could not sleep. The shame was a living thing, crawling over her skin. She was poison. She had fled one man who used her to prove his righteousness, only to ruin another man with her sin. She had to leave. It was the only decent thing to do. In the pre-dawn darkness, she packed her few belongings back into her small valise. She wrote a short, simple note, leaving it on the table. "Thank you. I am sorry." She slipped out of the bunkhouse and started walking down the long, dusty track that led back to town, though she had no idea what she would do when she got there. She had not gone more than a mile when she heard the sound of a horse behind her. She did not need to turn around. She knew who it was. She kept walking. He rode up alongside her and dismounted, blocking her path. He held the reins in one hand, his face a mask of stone in the pale moonlight. "Where do you think you are going?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am leaving," she said, not looking at him. "I will not be the cause of your ruin. Luke, I heard what that man said. I saw the way they look at you now. At me. I am a disgrace." "You are not." "Yes, I am," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "I am what they say I am. I have brought nothing but trouble to your door." He was silent for a moment. "I had trouble long before you got here," he said quietly. "My life was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was just empty." He took a step closer. "When you first got here, you were like a ghost, barely there, scared of your own shadow. I wanted you to stay that way. A ghost is easy. A ghost asks for nothing." He reached out and gently took the valise from her hand. Setting it on the ground, he put his hand under her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were clear and fierce in the moonlight. "I do not want a ghost," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I want you, Eliza, the trouble and all." Her resolve crumbled. A great, shuddering sob escaped her. He pulled her against him, and she buried her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, her tears soaking through to the warmth of his skin. He just held her, his strong arms a fortress around her, until the storm of her weeping had passed. He led her back to the ranch. He did not take her to the bunkhouse. He took her to his own bedroll in the barn, laying it out on a fresh pile of sweet-smelling hay. That night, their coming together was different. It was slower, deeper, a deliberate act of claiming and being claimed. There was a new, aching vulnerability between them, forged in the crucible of public shame and private loyalty. He undressed her with a reverence that felt like a prayer, kissing away the memory of every harsh word, every cold touch she had ever known. And as he moved within her, the emotions she had suppressed for so long broke free. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sadness or of pain. They were tears of release, of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. She was not a ghost. She was a woman. She was alive. And as the pleasure built within her, a feeling she was only just beginning to understand, a single, broken plea escaped her lips. The first time she had ever given voice to her own desire. "Do not stop," she whispered through her tears. "Please, do not stop." The fragile peace they had built was as delicate as a spider's web, glistening and beautiful in the morning sun, but vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. In the weeks that followed Eliza's decision to stay, a new rhythm settled over the ranch. It was a rhythm of two. They moved around each other in the quiet choreography of people who have learned each other's weight and space. The silence that had once been a barrier was now a form of communication, a shared language that spoke of comfort and acceptance. He would leave a rare desert wildflower on the table for her in the mornings. She would ensure his coffee was exactly as he liked it, strong and black. These small, unspoken kindnesses were the bricks with which they were building something that felt perilously like a home. Their intimacy in the barn at night was a world unto itself, a sanctuary of warmth and discovery. He had taught her heat, and in doing so, had taught her that she was not the cold, broken thing her husband had claimed her to be. She was learning the landscape of her own body, its capacity for a pleasure that was clean and honest and healing. She was learning to trust the strength in his hands, the gentleness in his kiss, the quiet reverence in his gaze. But the world was larger than the ranch, and its judgment was a shadow that followed them whenever they rode into redemption. The whispers still followed Eliza down the dusty street. The averted gazes were like small, sharp stones thrown at her back. Luke bore it all with a stony stoicism, his presence at her side an unwavering declaration of his loyalty. Yet, she saw the cost. She saw the other ranchers who now nodded curtly instead of stopping to talk. The way his name was no longer spoken with the easy respect it once had been. The stain she had brought with her was indelible. One Sunday, they rode into town for supplies. A small crowd was gathered outside the church, their Sunday best a stark collection of black coats and dark, sober dresses against the town's perpetual dust. An unfamiliar buggy, black and polished, was tied to the hitching post. As they drew closer, Eliza saw that Mrs. Gable was standing on the church steps next to a man she did not recognize. He was tall, like her former husband, but thinner, with a face that was all sharp angles and fervent piety. He was dressed in the same quality of oppressive black, a suit that seemed to absorb the light and give nothing back. As the new preacher spoke to the small cluster of townsfolk, his voice carried on the dry air. It was a voice accustomed to pulpits, smooth and confident, with an oily undertone of absolute certainty. It was a voice that reminded her so much of Michael's that a chill went down her spine despite the blistering heat. And so, we must be ever vigilant against the serpent of sin that slithers into our midst, into our very homes, wearing the face of innocence, he declared, his hand raised in a gesture of paternalistic warning. It was then that his eyes swept over the street and landed on her. For a split second, there was a flicker of confusion, then a dawning, predatory recognition. A slow, thin-lipped smile spread across his face. He excused himself from the group and started down the church steps, moving toward them with a deliberate, confident stride. "Luke, we should go," Eliza whispered, her hand instinctively going to his arm. But it was too late. The preacher stopped before them, his eyes fixed on Eliza, completely ignoring Luke. "Eliza," he said, his voice dripping with a false, pitying sorrow. "I had heard you had fled to the territories, a lost sheep wandering in the wilderness. I see the rumors were true." Eliza's blood ran cold. "I do not know you, sir." "Oh, but I know you, and I know the righteous man you abandoned." His eyes were small and hard, like chips of flint. "I am Reverend Albright, a cousin to the late Michael. I have taken a post here, to bring God's light to this dark land. It seems my work is more needed than I could have possibly imagined." His gaze flickered to Luke, dripping with condescension. "And I see you have fallen into the clutches of a new keeper." Luke stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Eliza and the preacher. His voice was dangerously quiet. "She is with me. You will address me." Albright gave a short, humorless laugh. "Ah, yes, the sinner's keeper. I have heard of you as well. Do you know what you are harboring, sir? A runaway wife, a woman who defied her sacred vows and shamed a man of God. She is a vessel of sin, a stain on any decent community." "Get away from her," Luke said, his voice a low growl. "I am here to save her immortal soul," Albright declared, his voice rising again to its pulpit theatricality. He turned his attention back to Eliza, who felt pinned by his gaze. "You will come with me, Eliza. You will pack your things. You will return east and you will repent. You will spend the rest of your days in prayer and supplication for the grievous sin you have committed. It is your only path to redemption." He was offering her the same cage she had just escaped. Only this time the door would be locked forever. The threat was clear. Do as he said, or he would expose her, paint her with the brush of her past until she was nothing but the town pariah, and Luke with her. "No," Eliza said, her voice small but firm. "No." Albright's eyebrows shot up in feigned surprise. "You will find, my dear woman, that you have no other choice. I will give you until the end of the week to come to your senses. God is merciful, but his patience is not infinite." He gave Luke a final, contemptuous sneer, then turned and walked back to his flock, his black coat cutting a sharp, sinister line against the dust. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent journey through a landscape that suddenly felt hostile and menacing. The shadows in the canyon seemed deeper, the twisted branches of the mesquite trees more skeletal. Eliza's past, which she had thought 1,000 miles behind her, had caught up to her and was now threatening to consume the small, fragile life she had built. That night, Luke came to her as she sat by the cold stove, staring into the darkness. He knelt before her and took her trembling hands in his. "I will marry you," he said, his voice low and certain. "We will go to the next county, find a justice of the peace. He will have no power over you if you are my wife. My name will protect you." His offer was a shield, a wall he was trying to build around her. It was an act of profound loyalty, the ultimate sacrifice for a man who had every reason to distrust the bonds of matrimony. A year ago, a week ago, she might have clung to that offer as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. But something within her had changed. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to fight a fire, to speak her own desire. She looked into his earnest, worried eyes and gently pulled her hands from his. "No, Luke." His face fell, a mixture of hurt and confusion. "Why not? It is the only way." "Because I will not be saved by another man's name," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. "Michael's name was a cage. I will not trade it for another, no matter how kind the keeper." She reached out and touched his rough cheek. "I have to do this myself, with my own name, or I will never truly be free." He did not understand. She could see that, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. And he did not argue. He simply nodded, his jaw tight, and stood up, leaving her alone with her decision. The end of the week came. On Sunday morning, Eliza put on her best dress, the same gray traveling dress she had arrived in, but now it was clean and mended. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up with firm, deliberate hands. She walked out of the bunkhouse and found Luke waiting for her, the wagon already hitched. He did not ask her what she was going to do. He just helped her up onto the seat and took the reins. They arrived in town to find Reverend Albright preaching on the church steps, his voice ringing with righteous fury as he spoke of the whore of Babylon. His sermon was for her. The townsfolk were gathered, a somber, judgmental sea of faces. Eliza slid down from the wagon. Luke was beside her in an instant. "You do not have to do this," he murmured. "Yes," she said, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I do." She walked forward, straight into the crowd, which parted before her like the Red Sea. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, forcing Albright to halt his sermon. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "Reverend Albright," she said, her voice thin at first, but gaining volume with every word. "You speak of sin. Let me tell you about sin." Albright's face contorted with fury. "This is a house of God. You will not desecrate it with your filth. This woman has a right to speak her own story." Luke's voice boomed from behind her. He had moved to stand at her back, not in front of her, a silent, solid support. Eliza looked out at the faces before her, the pinched, disapproving face of Mrs. Gable, the curious eyes of the children, the hard, weathered faces of the men. She took a deep breath, the metallic taste of fear sharp in her mouth. "My husband," she began, her voice shaking, "was a man of God, just like this one. He was respected, he was admired, and in the privacy of our home, he used his Bible to break my spirit. He told me that my body was a wicked thing, that my thoughts were sinful. He used his rights as a husband to punish me, to shame me, to make me feel worthless in the eyes of God and in my own." A murmur went through the crowd. The women were staring, their expressions a mixture of horror and a dawning, terrible recognition. He told me it was his duty to tame me, she continued, her voice growing stronger, fueled by the truth of her own words. And when I could no longer bear the weight of his righteousness, I fled. That is my crime. I chose to save myself rather than be slowly suffocated by a holy man's hate. She looked directly at Albright, her eyes blazing. You speak of repentance. Let him repent. Let all men who use God as a weapon to control their wives repent. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd one last time. They break us in private, and then they blame us in public. That is the great sin, and I will not be silent about it any longer. She finished, her entire body trembling with the effort. The silence that followed was absolute. The townsfolk were stunned, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and disbelief. They were a town divided. Some of the women looked at her with a new, dawning sympathy. Many of the men, including Jedediah Caldwell, looked at her with open hostility. Albright, for once, was speechless, his face purple with rage. The tide of public opinion had been stirred, but it had not yet turned. In the days that followed, the town's division became a palpable thing. Luke began to lose what little business he had left. A contract to provide horses to the stagecoach line was abruptly canceled. He was openly called a sinner's keeper, a man who harbored a mad, blasphemous woman. One evening in the saloon, Jedediah Caldwell and two of his hands cornered Luke, their voices loud and threatening. They warned him to get rid of that whore, or they would cleanse the valley themselves. They threatened to burn his barn to the ground. Luke came home that night with a bruised cheekbone and a grim set to his jaw. He did not tell Eliza what had happened, but she knew. The threat of violence now hung over them, as real and oppressive as the summer heat. The attack came on a moonless night a week later. They were awoken by the frantic whinnying of the horses. Luke was out of his bedroll in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing his rifle. Eliza was right behind him. The first thing they saw was a terrifying orange bloom against the blackness of the night. The large haystack near the barn was ablaze, the dry hay catching with explosive speed. "The fence is cut!" Luke yelled, pointing toward the corral where the horses were stampeding in terror. "They are trying to scatter the herd!" While Luke ran to head off the horses, shouting for Abe and Charlie, who were stumbling out of the bunkhouse. Eliza grabbed 2 heavy horse blankets from the barn. She soaked them at the water trough and ran toward the fire. The heat was a physical blow, a searing wall that pushed her back. The roar of the flames filled her ears, and the acrid smell of smoke burned her throat. She began beating at the edges of the fire, the wet blanket hissing as it met the flames. Luke joined her a moment later, and together, they fought the inferno. It was a desperate, primal battle. They were silhouettes against the raging fire, their movements frantic and determined. Sparks landed on Luke's shirt, and Eliza beat them out with her bare hands. A falling, burning timber grazed his arm, and he cried out in pain but did not stop. The smoke was thick and choking, and their lungs burned with every breath, but they did not surrender. They fought for their home, for their lives, for the small patch of earth they had claimed as their own. They managed to keep the flames from reaching the barn itself, but the haystack was a total loss. A fortune in winter feed turned to ash, as the fire finally died down to a smoldering, glowing ruin. They collapsed to the ground, exhausted, filthy, and hurt. They clung to each other amidst the smoke and the devastation. Eliza's hands were raw, and her face was streaked with soot and tears. Luke's arm was badly burned, the skin red and blistering. They were both physically hurt, their bodies aching with the effort of the fight. They looked at the smoldering remains of the haystack, at the trampled mud of the corral, at the ruin the hatred of others had wrought. Luke coughed, the sound racking his body. He looked at her, his pale eyes reflecting the dying embers. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I used to think that love could not exist where there was pain. I thought it had to be a peaceful thing." Eliza looked at their ruined yard, at his burned arm, at her own bleeding hands. She looked at his face, strong and weary and loyal, and she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. This, right here, was real. This was earned. "No," she whispered back, her voice thick with smoke and tears. "This is what love is." He pulled her closer, his soot-streaked face pressing against hers. They kissed, a kiss of desperation and survival, their lips tasting of ash and ruin. They were filthy and broken, but in that moment, under the scorched and starless sky, they were whole. That night, back in the quiet darkness of the barn, she was the one who reached for him. Her hands, though raw and shaking, were firm as she unbuttoned his shirt, her touch gentle as she tended to the burn on his arm. She looked into his eyes, a silent question passing between them. He did not move. He waited. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against his ear, and whispered the words he had spoken to her on that first night by the pump, the words that had changed everything. "Teach me heat again." The fire left them in a world of ash and silence. The winter feed for the cattle was gone, a black, smoldering scar on the land, with the last of their contracts lost to gossip and malice. The ranch was bleeding money it did not have. The future, which had briefly seemed like a path they could walk together, now looked like a cliff edge. Luke grew quieter than ever, the worry carving new, deeper lines into his face. He would stand for hours, staring at the ruined haystack, his hands clenched into fists of helpless frustration. But Eliza had not survived the Reverend Michael's spiritual tyranny to be defeated by mere ruin. A quiet, steady resolve had taken root in her soul, a resilience she had not known she possessed. She had fought a fire. She would fight this too. She inventoried their meager supplies, sacks of flour, sugar, dried apples, and a small but steady supply of eggs from her chickens. It was not much, but it was a start. "I can bake," she announced one evening, as they ate a sparse meal of beans. Luke looked at her, his expression weary. "There is no money for fancy bread. Eliza—" "Not for us," she corrected gently. "For the town. I can bake bread, apple pies. I can sell them at the market on Saturdays. It will not be much, but it will be something." He looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, and saw not a fragile woman in need of protection, but a partner. He saw the same fire in her eyes that had faced down a preacher, that had battled the flames beside him. He gave a slow, tired nod. "All right." The following Saturday, Eliza set up a small, rickety table at the edge of the Redemption Market. Her offerings were simple: fragrant loaves of sourdough bread, a half-dozen small apple pies, and jars of dried herbs she had gathered from the hills. She felt the stares of the other townswomen, a barrage of hostile curiosity. They gathered at the stall selling lace and ribbons, their heads together, their whispers like the rustle of dry, dead leaves. None of them came near her. Hours passed, the sun beat down, and her hope began to wilt. She was a pariah, and no one would buy bread from a fallen woman. She was just about to start packing her unsold goods when a woman dressed in widow's black paused before her table. She was older, with kind, sad eyes and a face etched with a gentle sorrow. Eliza recognized her as Sarah Blackwood, a woman whose husband had been killed in a mining accident the year before and who now lived a quiet, isolated life on the edge of town. "That bread smells wonderful," the widow said, her voice soft. "Thank you, ma'am," Eliza replied, her own voice tight with unshed tears of gratitude. "I will take 2 loaves," as Mrs. Blackwood paid. She met Eliza's eyes. "Do not mind them," she said in a low voice, nodding toward the other women. "Their hearts are as small and dry as last year's corn husks." That small act of kindness was like a dipper of cool water on a scorched throat. Later that day, another outcast found her, a young girl, no more than 14, with shining black hair and eyes so dark they seemed to hold the night sky. She was half Apache, the daughter of a local trapper and a woman who had long since vanished. The girl, Lena, was treated by the townsfolk as little more than a ghost, a creature of the fringes who was either ignored or openly scorned. She hovered near Eliza's stall, her gaze fixed on a small apple pie. "Would you like that?" Eliza asked gently. The girl flinched, startled to be spoken to. She nodded, her eyes wide. "Here," Eliza said, wrapping the pie in a cloth. "Take it, no charge." Lena stared at her, then at the pie, as if it were a trick. Slowly, she took it, her slender brown fingers brushing against Eliza's. She did not speak, but the look of profound, silent gratitude in her dark eyes was more eloquent than any words. She scurried away, and Eliza watched her go, feeling the first fragile threads of a new community being woven, a small tapestry of the lonely and the outcast. While Eliza was building bridges, Luke was rebuilding their defenses. He began the hard, back-breaking work of clearing the debris and starting on a new barn. The first day, he worked alone, his movements grim and solitary. But on the second day, something shifted. One of their neighbors, a quiet rancher named Peterson, who had been among the silent onlookers at Eliza's confrontation with the preacher, rode up. He did not speak. He simply dismounted, picked up an axe, and began to help Luke trim logs. They worked side by side for 3 hours, the only sounds the bite of the axe and their own labored breathing. When he was done, Peterson simply wiped his brow, nodded once to Luke, and rode away. The next day, 2 other men appeared, bringing with them a wagon of fresh-cut lumber. They left it near the building site and were gone before Luke could even properly thank them. It was a silent apology, a grudging admission of respect from men who did not have the words to say they were sorry. They would not defend him in the saloon, but they would help him raise a barn. In the West, it was the truest form of fellowship. The ranch began to heal. The money from Eliza's market stall was a trickle, but it was enough to buy grain, to keep them from ruin. The frame of the new barn rose against the sky, a skeleton of hope. The silent support of their neighbors was a balm on the wound of the town's judgment. One evening, after a long week of work, Luke came to her. "Let us ride out," he said. "Just us." He took her deep into the canyons, to a place she had never been before. The moonlight was so bright it turned the red rock walls to silver. Tucked away in a hidden cove, sheltered by ancient cottonwood trees, was a small hot spring. Steam rose from its surface like a spectral mist, carrying the faint, clean scent of sulfur. They shed their clothes in the cool night air, their bodies pale and ghostly in the moonlight. There was no shame between them, no hesitation. They slipped into the water. The heat, a blissful shock that soaked deep into their tired muscles. The spring was a baptism, washing away the soot and the sorrow, the ash and the anger. They floated in the warm, dark water. The brilliant canopy of stars spread out above them, so close they felt they could fall into the sky. He moved toward her through the water, his hands finding her waist, his body warm and solid against hers. They explored each other again, their movements slow and languid in the buoyant water. It was a rediscovery, a silent affirmation of all they had survived. Afterward, they lay on a blanket on the smooth rock beside the spring. Eliza was resting her head on his shoulder, her wet hair fanned out across his chest. He was looking at her, his expression more open and tender than she had ever seen it. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "when I first saw you, standing on that train platform, you looked like a bird with a broken wing, like the first gust of wind would carry you away." He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "But you are not. You are like one of those wildflowers that grows high up on the mesa, the ones that bloom in the cracks of the rock where there is no soil and no water, a place where nothing is supposed to be able to grow. But they do. They are the toughest, most beautiful things in this whole desert." He looked into her eyes, and his voice was thick with an emotion that made her heart ache. "That is what you are, Eliza, my wildflower." Tears welled in her eyes and traced silent paths down her temples. They were not tears of sadness or of pain, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like a kind of grace, to be seen, truly seen, for what she was, for what she had become. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of peace, and like all such moments, it was destined to be shattered. They returned to the ranch the next morning to find 2 horses tied to their hitching post. One belonged to Reverend Albright. The other belonged to the town's lawman, a nervous, perpetually sweating man named Sheriff Miller. Albright stood on their porch as if he owned it, a look of smug triumph on his face. The sheriff stood beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Luke," Sheriff Miller said, his eyes darting everywhere but at them. I have a warrant here." "A warrant for what?" Luke asked, his body going rigid, his hand moving instinctively closer to the rifle in its saddle scabbard. "For her," Albright said, pointing a dramatic finger at Eliza. "I have brought formal charges against this woman, fraud, and theft of virtue." "That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard," Luke growled. "Is it?" Albright's smile was reptilian. "She came to this territory under false pretenses, committing fraud by misrepresenting herself as a virtuous bride-to-be. She then absconded from her lawful husband, thereby stealing from him the virtue that was his property under God and the law." He looked at the sheriff. "The charges are legal. You will arrest her." The sheriff shuffled his feet, his hand hovering over his own pistol. "Luke, I do not want any trouble. I have to take her in." "You will not lay a hand on her," Luke said, his voice flat and deadly. He swung down from his horse, moving to stand in front of Eliza's. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the final battle. "Luke, no," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Do not do this." She looked at the sheriff. "I will go with you, sir, but I will not go to a cell. You will hold a hearing, a proper, public hearing. I will face these charges, and I will be heard." The sheriff, seeing a way out of a violent confrontation, readily agreed. The hearing was held 2 days later in the town's largest room, the saloon. The poker tables were pushed against the walls to make space for the crowd. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces a tense sea of judgment and curiosity. At a table at the front sat a figure who made Reverend Albright's smug expression falter. The traveling circuit judge had arrived in town a day early, and the judge was a woman. Her name was Esther Collins, an iron-gray woman in her late 50s with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. Albright presented his case first, his voice booming with righteous indignation. He painted Eliza as a deceitful, licentious Jezebel who had broken a good man's heart and flouted the laws of God and man. He used words like property and duty and sin. Then it was Eliza's turn. Judge Collins looked at her. "Well, miss, what do you have to say for yourself?" Eliza stood. She did not look at Albright. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the nervous face of the sheriff, at the hard sneer of Jedediah Caldwell, at the quiet, supportive gaze of Sarah Blackwood and the wide, worried eyes of Lena, who stood in the back. And finally, she looked at Luke, who stood against the far wall, his arms crossed, his presence a silent, unwavering anchor. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and plain, reaching every corner of the silent room. "I did not come west to commit fraud," she began. "I came west to survive. The man the Reverend speaks of, my husband, was his cousin, and he was a man who believed a wife was a possession, like a horse or a field, to be used as he saw fit. He believed her soul was his to mold and her body was his to command. He did not break my bones. No, he did something far worse. He tried to break my spirit. He tried to convince me that I was worthless, that my own thoughts were evil, and that my only value was in my silent obedience to him." She looked directly at the judge. "He did all of this in the privacy of his own home, behind a locked door, with a Bible in his hand. And when I chose to save myself from that prison, I was called a sinner. I was blamed. Her voice grew stronger. This is what is done to women. We are broken in private, and then we are blamed in public. Our spirits are crushed, our wills are stolen, and they call it a man's right. Our virtue is not a thing to be stolen. It is our own. It is the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. And my truth is this: I am not a criminal. I am a survivor. She finished and stood tall, her heart pounding, the silence in the room absolute. Judge Collins stared at Eliza for a long, unblinking moment. Then she turned her gaze upon Reverend Albright, who was sputtering, his face red with outrage. "Reverend," the judge said, her voice as cold and sharp as a winter morning, "you have brought a charge of theft before this court, but I have heard no evidence of stolen goods. You speak of virtue as if it were a side of beef a man can lock in his smokehouse. Let me be plain. A woman's spirit is her own. It is not the property of her husband. It is not the property of her church, and it is not the property of this court." She banged a small wooden gavel on the table. "These charges are frivolous, malicious, and an insult to the laws of this territory. Case dismissed." A wave of murmurs and gasps went through the crowd. Reverend Albright stood, speechless. As Eliza walked past him, the townsfolk parted before her, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. She walked straight to Luke. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the tremors running through his body, the release of weeks of tension and fear. He held her for a long time, right there in the middle of the crowded saloon. When he finally pulled back, he looked down at her, his pale eyes shining with an emotion so fierce it stole her breath. "You burned the shame out of both of us," he whispered, his voice thick. "All of it. You burned it all to ash." The hearing in the saloon did not wash the town of its judgment overnight, but it did change the tide. It was like a long drought breaking. The first rains do not make a river, but they soften the ground. Reverend Albright, his authority shattered not by force, but by a woman's plain-spoken truth, left redemption within the week, his polished black buggy kicking up a cloud of indignant dust as it disappeared down the road. He left a silence in his wake, a space for the town to reconsider itself. Months passed. The searing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn, and then to the sharp, clear chill of a mild desert winter. The ranch, which had been on the brink of collapse, began to breathe again. The new barn, framed by Luke and his neighbors, now stood proud and strong, its raw pine smelling of resilience and fresh starts. Luke managed to acquire a few head of cattle from Peterson. Not a contract, but a deal made on a handshake and a shared look of understanding. The trickle of money from Eliza's market stall became a steady, if small, stream. She added jars of spiced apple butter and bags of dried jerky, and people began to buy them, not just outcasts like Sarah Blackwood and Lena, but other townsfolk too. Their names, Eliza's and Luke's, were no longer whispered with the salacious scorn of scandal. Instead, they were spoken with a kind of quiet, grudging respect. They were the people who had fought a fire and won. They were the man who had stood by his woman, and the woman who had stood up for herself. In the harsh arithmetic of the frontier, survival earned a respect that piety could not command. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, now greeted them with a genuine warmth, and even Jedediah Caldwell, the man who had threatened to burn them out, would offer a stiff, formal nod when their wagons passed on the road. It was not friendship, but it was peace. Eliza's small community of outcasts grew. After the hearing, Sarah Blackwood had hugged her, her thin shoulders shaking with tears. "You said what I never had the words to say," she had whispered. Lena began to spend more and more time at the ranch, her silent watchfulness slowly blossoming into a shy smile. She had a quick mind and a deep hunger to learn, and it was for her that Eliza began her school. They started on the porch in the afternoons, with a piece of smoothed slate and a nub of chalk. Eliza taught Lena her letters, the strange, magical shapes that could be coaxed into forming words. Sarah Blackwood soon joined them, her brow furrowed in concentration as she, a woman in her 50s, learned to write her own name for the first time. Soon, 2 other women began to attend the informal lessons. One was the young wife of a blacksmith, who was tired of her husband reading her mail to her. The other, to Eliza's immense surprise, was the wife of one of Jedediah Caldwell's own ranch hands, a woman who had once been among the most virulent whisperers. She arrived one afternoon, her face a mixture of shame and determination, and asked if she, too, could learn. Eliza welcomed them all. She did not just teach them reading and writing. As they worked, their hands clumsy with the chalk, they began to share their stories. They spoke of loneliness, of harsh husbands, of the silent daily struggles that were the common lot of women. Eliza shared her own story again, not in a public declaration of defiance, but in the quiet, supportive circle of her sisters. In teaching them to read the world, she was helping them learn to write their own futures. Luke would often watch them from a distance as he mended a harness or sharpened a tool. He saw the way they looked at Eliza, with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She was not just the woman he loved. She was becoming a force in her own right, a quiet center of strength for others. The broken bird he had first seen was now teaching others how to fly. He came to her one late afternoon as she was feeding the chickens, the low sun casting long shadows across the yard. The air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass. He did not have a flower in his hand or a speech prepared. He simply stood beside her, his presence solid and comforting. "The new barn is finished," he said. "The herd is small, but it is growing. We have enough to last the winter." "Yes," she said, scattering the last of the grain. "We have done well." He was silent for a moment, his gaze on the distant purple mountains. "This place, it is a hard place. Eliza, the work is never done. The land does not give up its gifts easily." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious and clear. "I am not an easy man. I know that. I do not have a lot of words." He took a deep breath. "I am asking you to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, not because you need my protection, and not as my wife. If that name still feels like a cage to you, I am asking you to stay as my partner, to build this place with me, to own it with me, to be my equal in all things. Your name next to mine, not under it." His words were the most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to stand beside her. He was not giving her his name as a shield, but asking to share the strength of hers. The love she felt for him in that moment was a vast, powerful thing, as big and real as the land that stretched out around them. She did not need to speak her answer. She simply stepped forward, put her arms around his neck, and kissed him. It was a kiss of profound and absolute certainty, a silent vow made under the wide-open sky. It was better than any ring. The official celebration of the new barn was a true barn raising, a party to thank the community that had, in its own silent way, helped them rebuild. They came from all the surrounding ranches. Peterson was there, and the men who had brought the lumber. Even Jedediah Caldwell arrived, his wife on his arm, and he brought with him a gift, a young, purebred Hereford bull. He presented it to Luke with a stiff, formal speech about neighborly duty, but his eyes held a new and unfamiliar respect. It was his apology, made in the only language he knew. Eliza, Sarah, and the other women had spent days preparing. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted chickens, potato salads, baked beans, and a dozen different pies. As evening fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm, festive glow over the yard. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon a lively tune was cutting through the cool night air. Couples began to dance in the cleared space in front of the new barn. Luke watched them, a rare, small smile on his face. He turned to Eliza. "Will you?" he asked, holding out his hand. A knot of her old fear tightened in her stomach. Dancing. It was a frivolous, worldly thing. The Reverend Michael had preached entire sermons against its evils, the way it led to impure thoughts and sinful contact. She had never danced in her life. "I do not know how," she whispered, her hands suddenly clammy. "Neither do I," he said, his smile widening. "We will learn together." He took her hand, his grip warm and firm, and led her into the circle of lantern light. He put one hand on her waist, and she tentatively placed hers on his shoulder. They were clumsy at first, their steps uncertain, but he was a steady anchor, and she followed his lead. They moved slowly, awkwardly, in a small circle, oblivious to the other, more graceful dancers around them. He looked down at her, his eyes shining in the lantern light, and she looked up at him. The music, the warm light, the feeling of his strong arm around her, it all conspired to dissolve the last of her old fears. A giddy, bubbling joy rose up in her, a feeling so light and new she thought she might float away. She laughed, a real, unburdened laugh, and the sound of it was the sweetest music she had ever heard. Later that night, long after the last wagon had rattled away, they took a blanket and walked out into the desert, away from the house and the barn, to the place where the silence was deepest. They lay under the vast, star-dusted sky, the same sky that had once seemed so terrifying and indifferent. She snuggled against his side, his arm a familiar, comforting weight around her. The scent of wood smoke and pine still clung to his clothes. She thought back to that first night, when she had stood alone in the dark, a world away from this moment, a lifetime away from the woman she was now. "Luke," she said softly. "I am here." "That first night," she whispered, "the night of the storm. You told me you would teach me heat." She paused, tracing the pattern of a constellation with her finger. "You did, but you taught me more than that." She turned her head to look at him, her heart so full she could barely speak the words. "You did not just teach me heat, you taught me home." He did not answer. He simply rolled toward her, his expression full of a love so profound it needed no words. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Then he gently rolled her onto her stomach and began to press soft, slow kisses along her spine. He kissed the bare skin of her back, each touch a benediction, a silent act of worship. And as he kissed her, he whispered her name, over and over, not with the urgency of passion, but with the quiet reverence of a prayer. "Eliza, Eliza, Eliza." As the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the jagged peaks of the mountains, the land felt no less wild, no less untamed. The wind still whispered its lonely secrets through the canyons, and the cry of the coyote still echoed in the hills. But they were no longer strangers in it. They had been tested by its harshness and healed by its beauty. They were a part of its fabric, their story woven into its ancient, rugged tapestry. Their love burned, a steady and enduring flame against the vastness of the desert. It was a fire born not in the fleeting heat of scandal, but in the enduring warmth of survival. It was a joy that had not been given, but earned, breath by breathless breath, in the heart of a wild and beautiful land. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.